I'm going to be looking this way. Got a little setup here. You guys are here. This is my presentation right here. So I have lots of monitors, but apologize for not looking at you. My name is Teo Lachev. I have been your fearless leader for the past 10 years or so. Started the group in 2010, and not sure actually if any of our organizers is joining us. There isn't much to organize nowadays, but besides me, there is actually a whole group of people actually that helps me with this, with the food and drinks while we meet on premises in good times. Also by spreading the message in different platforms. So this is going to be actually our September meeting, although it says August 31st. And the reason why we're doing a little bit in advance is because, as you know, next week is Labor Day in the States, and that's why we kind of move it forward. There are some new people, real quick. Our main website is atlantabipass.org. Actually, we have a few websites, but the main one is this one here, right? atlantabi.pass.org. So if you haven't affiliated yourself, please affiliate with our group, Atlanta Business Intelligence Group, so you can get reminders. And if you plan to attend our next meeting, please let us know, so at least we know how many people to expect. While on this page, I want to bring your attention to the recording link. So we started kind of recording these meetings, and I post the recordings in this link here, Atlanta BI Rex bit.ly. This is where the recordings go, right? So far we recorded three meetings. We typically meet on the first Monday of the month. So our next one is going to be October 5th. We're going to go back to a regular schedule. Spread the word, get involved. Sponsors, well, the current situation kind of took care of it, so we don't really need sponsors at this point. But speakers are always trying to find good presenters, good speakers. So if you want to present something or know somebody who can, let me know. If you want to donate a few bucks, you can do that. We're going to use that if we don't have a sponsor once we start meet back in person at the Microsoft office. Jobs. Does anybody have any job news? Is anybody looking for BI talent? Yes, I hear some movement on the line. Anybody looking for BI developers, Power BI, Microsoft BI? Anybody? Nope. All right. Usually we do have, announcements, but looks like today is not a good day. Cool. Couple of events by the end of the year. Microsoft Ignite, the biggest Microsoft conference, complimentary digital event, September 22nd, 24th. And that's the URL. You can go ahead and register. This is going to be in a few weeks. And then the PASS Summit, the organizations that we are affiliated with. I'm sure everyone by now has heard about PASS Summit. So Microsoft Ignite is everything, not just BI, everything Microsoft, while PASS Summit is more on the data side of things, including BI. So that's going to be a paid digital event running on from November 10 to 13, 2020. We have a little code here that you can use to register and get a little bit of discount, and that's the URL. Okay. So next thing to kind of touch upon, some interesting features that caught my attention since the last time. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list. As you know, every month we get a new version of Power BI Desktop. So it's got lots of features, but those are the most interesting ones. Nothing actually earth-shattering for the past month. So we have a blocking classic workspaces, and I'm going to explain that. I'm going to give you a little bit of overview of what these features are. Then I think the next one, at least has been asked for a while, to lasso points in charts. Now we have it. And finally, we have something called perspectives for visual personalization. So I'm going to show a few demos in a moment, kind of introduce these new features, but for the time being, let's just go through the rest of the slides. So this meeting, is going to be on Power BI calculation groups. Initially, the guy in the cube, Patrick LeBlanc, was supposed to do it, but he had to go urgently to visit his family in Houston, I believe, or Louisiana. You know what happened. Those of you in the States, you know what's going on in there. I hope everything is okay with him. So a co-worker, colleague of him from the CAT team, Phil Seamark, joining us all the way from New Zealand, is going to actually present tonight Power BI calculation groups. And next meeting is going to be October 5th. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and Power BI. Paco from SolidQ is going to do it, right? So let's talk a little bit about this, kind of showing you a little bit about this new features. The first one is blocking classic workspaces. So those of you who are following Power BI, they know that at the very beginning, the workspaces actually existed since the very beginning of Power BI. It's a way for us to organize Power BI content. But the initial version of the workspaces was kind of very limited, right? From a security standpoint. And also, it had this beautiful side effect that when you go to Office 365 and create like SharePoint Office group or Teams group or any other group, because groups are omnipresent in Office 365, these groups automatically show as workspaces in Power BI, right? So based on my feedback from clients, they actually hate that feature because that actually leads to workspace explosion. User go to Power BI and see like hundreds of workspaces there. If all the workspaces they're members of, it doesn't matter that they don't have any Power BI content. So organizations are looking for a way to block this workspaces, the V1, the original workspaces. Since then, Microsoft introduced a new version of the workspaces, which are the best practice right now, but the old one, the classic, the V1 workspaces are still there. So now we have a new feature, which is a tenant setting feature, tenant level setting feature, which is called, and it's called Block Classic Workspace Creation, right? So if we enable it, several things happen. Number one, users in Power BI cannot create classic workspaces. In fact, by default, the V2 workspaces are created when you actually create a new workspace, but there is an option for you to switch to the old one. So if you enable this, this no longer be an option, and that's a good thing. Number two, if users create new groups in Office 365, let's say a Microsoft Teams group, these groups no longer show in Power BI. And number three, if there is a use, let's say you started with some initially had some groups and they actually became V1 workspaces. If no one in Power BI has accessed this original workspaces, V1 workspaces, no one, meaning that not a single person went to that workspace. because if somebody goes, then Power BI will think that that workspace actually it's a good workspace and is going to activate it. But if these workspaces were never activated, nobody went in there, then also they're going to magically disappear from the navigation bar. So we don't have an option yet to filter the view one workspaces. I hope at some point we're gonna actually see that, but that's what the situation is. At least it's kind of an improvement in the kind of on the right path. What do you guys think about it? Yeah or no or nay? Yay or nay?
Yes, it was a mess. All those workspaces.
The workspaces are a mess. Yes. Can't believe it. That's the first question, number one. How do we actually get rid of these workspaces? Now we have them. So I'll try to actually monitor the chat as much as I can. If you guys have any questions, I like this feature. What does it look like? It's asking Bruce, what does it look like? Well, what I just explained, that if you enable this feature, then three things will happen. Clean is always better, good feature. Yep, okay, cool. So the next thing is, that's actually very simple. So you've got Power BI report. Let's go and take a look at that one here. So that report has a scatter chart, has a column chart, maybe a line chart. What I want to do is to be able to lasso a data points here. So you guys previously know that you can hold the control key or the shift key and start clicking actually data points here for selection and things like this. But my goal now is to actually conveniently select points by just dragging the mouse. And now I can do that. So, oops, you have to do, this always gets me, but you have to hold the control key. So you hold the control key, and now we can actually select points. Like I selected these two first data points, and that cross filters the other chart. But not only this, I can also do extended selection. So let's say I selected Samsung and LG, but now I want to actually select the other devices here. Well, I can hold the shift key and keep on selecting them. So keep on actually dragging the mouse and selecting those things, right? So we have extended selection. And what about the line chart? Let's go and flip to what? To this guy here. All right, here we have a very ugly looking line chart. So the same thing, hold the control, drag, and if you want to select more, hold the shift and drag, right? But if I want to unselect them, just click on an empty area on the chart, unselect. With some background noise, guys, I'm going to do something very rude indeed, but I'm going to mute you. And if you want to ask something, I'll just unmute yourself. Cool, so we've got that. But then what else we've got here? We've got perspectives for visual personalization. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you have followed Microsoft BI for a while, you know that we have something called analysis services, multidimensional and tabular. And in these tools, we can create perspectives. Why we want to do that? And what do they do? Well, imagine I have an organizational semantic layer, always a good idea, right? Let's say you have a data warehouse, you put a previously known layer as a cube, and now we call it semantic data model because we want to be cool. So you put that on top, but then you follow best practices and you create like a centralized semantic layer that has lots of tables. You can finance, you can have customer care, have inventory. And that could be overwhelming, both for the developer and also for the end user, right? So we want to have a way to actually filter this perceived complexity by creating logical views on top of that metadata, and perspectives in an analysis service allow us to do that. Now actually you can create perspectives in Power BI datasets. That feature wasn't previously available, but now we can, with the caveat that Power BI Desktop doesn't have a UI for it. It never had. So we have to use what? We have to use a community tool called Tabular Editor. So that's why we have this in Power BI Desktop. We have these external tools so we can launch it conveniently. And then you can actually go and create perspectives. I'm not going to do this, but it's a fairly easy thing to do. And the Microsoft blog goes in kind of step by step. So, okay, so I create a perspective, and that's all great. But nowhere in Power BI Desktop still doesn't know a thing about perspectives. So what can I do with this perspective now that I created it? Well, Power BI Service, there is a feature in Power BI Service that knows about perspectives. And that feature is called visual personalization. And if you haven't discovered that feature yet, actually, it's a very cool feature. So let me just give you kind of a real life story. So I'm helping one kind of a large organizations with Power BI, and what they want to do, imagine you have a matrix report like this, and you have a hierarchy that users can drill down. Some users want to be at the, let's say, the region level. Some users want to see that data at the country level. So every user wants to actually personalize this. And believe it or not, it's very complicated for them to drill up or drill down or to export that in Excel. It's just a complicated thing. They don't want to do it. They want easy way. So far, what they've been doing it for every requirement like this, they're going to create a new report page. They're going to remove things that they don't want on the visual, publish the report, and now the report there's a new page for this particular view that they requested. Now you can do things, obviously you can continue this approach, but there is trade-offs. The more pages you add to more reports, they have to be maintained and all that. So now what we can do, actually, we can personalize visuals. And now this feature is in preview. So if you want to try it, what do? Quick as a bunny, you go to option and settings, and then you have to enable two things. So it's a two-step process. Like one step is not enough, we got to do two. First one is you go to the preview features and you enable personalize visuals. All right. And that's going to ask you to restart Power BI Desktop. And the second thing you have to do is to go to the report settings and say allow report readers to personalize visuals. Have to do it. So it has to be enabled on report by report basis, and actually can be further fine-tuned. So for example, if you don't want specific visual to be personalized, I think there is a setting for you to do that. But by default, once you check that checkbox, the user can personalize all visuals on the report. They can, but they never ever make permanent changes to the report. In fact, when the report is published to Power BI service, they don't even have to have edit permissions. So they don't have to actually go to edit the report to personalize it. That's very cool. They can have a read-only access. They can be a reader, they can be a viewer, and they can still do it. Great. So let's say I want this guy here to be to personalize it. Let's say I don't want to see all this breakdown. So I just hover on the visual, and here we have a new icon, right? So this icon is this personalization thing, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to click it, and that opens this nice personalized pane where I could make changes to that visual. right? So for example, instead of having a country and a region, I'm going to take them out. I just want this initial breakdown, and that's good enough for me. If I want to, what other changes can I make? I can actually add fields or remove fields from the buckets. For example, instead of net profit, maybe I want to see not only net profit, but something else together. So you can make basic changes. Also, you can change the visualization type. Instead of a matrix, maybe I want to flip it to a table. So you make those simple changes, and then what happens if you don't save them? If you don't do anything special? Well, you lose them forever, which is not a good thing, right? So we want to persist those changes. How do we persist them? Bookmarks. We don't go and save the report as a new report because they wouldn't have even permissions to do that. Remember, the edit feature is not there, but we got to bookmark it. So if I go here to my personal bookmarks, I can say add a personal bookmark. I'm going to say this is my personal, let's just call it Atlanta BI, but you can put any name you want. And if I want this to be the default view, which means that every time I go to this report, I want actually this to be exactly the way I configure it, the way I personalize it, I can go and actually make this the default view. So these changes are user by user, user specific. So different users can personalize different things in a different way. They all remembered as bookmarks. So what happens now that I created that?
Theo, I think you've put yourself on mute. We can't hear you. Just for that last 20 seconds or so, you're showing up as mute. I wonder if I can unmute you. No, you're still on mute.
Can you guys hear me now?
You now. Yep,
Okay.
I can hear you now.
So sorry, I don't know how that happened. That's a weird thing.
Just the last 40 seconds we lost you there. We could see you talking, but I'll go on mute now.
Got you. So guys, I'm gonna start from the very beginning. Welcome to this meeting. No, I'm just joking. All right, so it's just the last 20 seconds or so. Okay, so I hopefully you got the personalization thing. I hope that you got that. The only way to save the changes will be to actually create a bookmark. You guys have to tell me those things. You gotta interrupt me immediately. I'm relying on you guys, otherwise I'm gonna be talking here until midnight. Okay, so we said that to persist these changes, you have to create a personal bookmark. And then when you go back to the report, you see the initial view. If you haven't enabled this, make a default view thing, but then you can go to your personal bookmark, you can select it, and now you see that visual the way it was personalized. So what happens if the original author redeploys the report? Again, your changes are preserved. As long as this visual is there, and that connection is maintained by the identifier of the visual behind the scenes. So as long as you haven't deleted or something like that, the original author, then that personalization is going to be still there. So the whole reason why I'm telling you this is because if you have a perspective, let's say if I'm a user and if I want to personalize, my visual, then potentially when I go and actually start working with these fields, let's say if I want to add a new field, I will see the entire metadata in my model. And if that's a semantic organizational model, there could be a lot of tables here. So if you create perspectives, these perspectives now they're going to show here, and you can say, I want to just focus on specific perspective and just get a filtered view of that metadata. So perspective are not a security mechanism. They're just meant for giving you a different view, logical view of the metadata. We cannot use it for security or anything like this. But personalized visual actually takes advantage of this feature.
Teo,
Any
could
questions?
you speak to, yeah, could you speak to the security thing that you just mentioned? I was curious about that already. So if you had row level security enabled, does that not work with the personalized visuals?
No, actually it will work, Stephanie. So row level security has nothing to do with this perspective. So personalized visuals, it always works.
Okay.
There is no way for the user to bypass row level security. But I mentioned that this perspectives feature, it's meant just to simplify the metadata. Instead of the user seeing many tables, they can just filter the tables that they want. It's not meant as a replacement for row level security. In fact, it's not meant as any security feature. It's just not. The users can easily bypass that.
Okay. And then could you use this on dashboards so you could personalize a visual and then post it to a dashboard, a personalized dashboard?
That is something that I haven't tried, but I don't see why. So, for example, I have this personalized visual, and I see the push pin. So let's say I want to pin it to Python demo. And then let's go back and see what happened. Actually, I can go to the dashboard here. See, it's right there. So actually, yeah, your personalized views, you can actually pin them to dashboard.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
How tolerant of changes is it if, say, they change a different part of the visual? Like if you're saving your view, you're just saving it for that visual there on the right, not. And if they get rid of the chart, that doesn't really affect the other, right?
So they won't be able to get rid of the chart. You cannot completely remove visuals because remember we're talking about viewers. These users have no rights to make underlying changes to the report. So I don't think you can actually delete a visual right now. You can. You also cannot change the layout. The layout is fixed. I cannot move it around. But I can make the changes that I showed you. I can change the visualization. I can change the fields. Other than that, layout changes are not permitted. Any layout changes will require editing the report, going to edit mode. And then if you have this permission, of course, all bets are off. You can do whatever you want with this report, right?
Gotcha. Yeah. Now, if the author, rearranges things, it's still going to know.
Yes.
You had those preferences.
Absolutely. In fact, as a homework, I encourage you guys to go back to the original report, shuffle things around, maybe move them to another page if you want, as long as the identifier of the visual is the same. So for example, if I go back to Power BI Desktop, I change this, I move it to another place, and then I republish the report, then my changes are going to be, they're actually going to be, they're going to apply, right? Because it goes by the identifier. Every visual has a system identifier, a GUID. So as long as that GUID is still there, this personalization feature will still work. If it's not there, it's not going to crash. So you're not going to get an error. It's going to kind of gracefully ignore that visual. And by the way, you can personalize multiple visuals at the same time. So let's say if I'm a user and I have a bunch of visuals, I want to personalize them all. I can click on actually this icon for every visual, personalize them, and then I can go and create a bookmark. Or I can personalize them one at a time and create bookmarks for each personalization. So it's a pretty cool feature. I think very useful. I don't think many people know about it. Relatively new, but please take a look at that. Any other questions? All right. Well, let's do the main presentation. Phil, I would appreciate if you can take over from here.
Sure, no problem. So I'll share my screen
Absolutely, go ahead.
and let me know when you can see this.
We see it.
Okay, now as I said to Theo earlier, I'm not one for designing beautiful and colorful PowerPoint presentation slides, but hopefully it just allows us to easily follow what I'm going to cover. So, but I'll start with introducing myself. My name is Philip Seamark. I work for Microsoft on the Power BI team, more specifically on the customer advisory team. So this particular team is a small group within the Power BI team that works with all sizes of customers and companies looking to use Power BI and just helping them with challenges and doing deep dives, helping customers solve challenges. So I think the initial presenter here was Patrick LeBlanc, who is another member of the Power BI team. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today. But you've got me. Hopefully you can understand my accent. I'm dialing in from New Zealand, which is about as far south on the planet that you can get. So in Microsoft's Antarctic outpost. I think they must just send people here that just get into too much trouble, maybe. In the Power BI CAT team, I tend to specialize on DAX and data modeling. And today I'm going to be talking about introducing you to calculation groups, which kind of falls into that bucket. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat window, or if it's really pressing, you're welcome to come off mute and ask me a question. But I will allow time at the end for questions on calculation groups, but also perhaps if you've got a question about DAX or data modeling, maybe I can help you with that too. But outside of the presentation today, you're very welcome to contact me as well. I'll make sure that my contact details are at the end. I do quite enjoy relaxing, trying to solve interesting challenges that people have, and it's a good way for me to learn. So it's how I relax.
Phil, apologize for interrupting you. People want to see you. Apparently, they're asking, why is your camera not on? And if that's for privacy reason, that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to share that feedback.
No, not at all. Hopefully you can see me.
Yes, we can. Hi.
I find it quite interesting, particularly in these post-COVID era where there's a lot more happening online. There seems to be a schism in meetings I'm involved with about half the people have their cameras on and half don't. I generally don't because I look terrible, and because of my time zone, it's often very early in the morning for me, and I'm not at my best. But hopefully this is okay. I don't have great lighting, and the other thing is also on my CAT team I have people like Patrick and Adam who and Matthew Roach who do a really professional job with presenting video-based sessions on YouTube and the like, and I just can't keep up with that. So hopefully this is all right.
Sure.
So yeah, and then the background here is where I live. I live out in the countryside in New Zealand. So this is actually a photo out the window where I normally sit in my home office.
It's a beautiful country, just like as I'm watching Lord of the Ring, right? It was filmed in there in New Zealand, right?
Yeah, and a lot of it was filmed around where I live. Peter Jackson is based in Wellington, and there's a number of places that you can go and visit, and day tours if you're ever in this part of the world. They show you where this is Rivendell or this is some other parts. So if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you'll definitely be probably driving past my house at some point if you're ever in New Zealand on one of those tours. Cool. So I'll get back to sharing my screen, and I'll bring my camera back at the end for questions. So I am sharing my screen. Yes, I am sharing my screen. Okay, yes. Cool. So you can see intro to calculation groups. Fantastic. So today's agenda, we're going to look at what are calculation groups. A lot of people have probably heard the term. But the feature is, while it exists in Power BI at the moment, there's no UI element for you to go and right-click and create a new calculation group. And we'll talk about that a little later in the session. So I think a lot of people have perhaps heard the term calculation groups and heard that maybe they're useful for certain things. So the idea of today's session is to hopefully unravel that mystery a little bit for anyone on the call. We're going to talk about where can I use calculation groups? How do we create a calculation group? How do we configure them? And lastly, we'll set aside some time for questions. So I'm going to do a demo of a couple of calculation groups. One is going to be the equivalent of the Hello World, or my first calculation groups on a demo data set. And the other one is going to showcase something a little more sophisticated that you can do, but it won't be terribly deep or heavy. And absolutely, at the end of the session, I will upload my deck and the PBIX file that I'll be using today at the end. So you can download this and pull it apart and repeat perhaps what I've shown you today. So hopefully that's fine. So what actually are calculation groups? Well, the primary focus is to provide a mechanism that allows you to almost template a pattern of a measure and apply it across a lot of columns in your models. So in my role on the CAT team, I see a lot of models, and often I see a very large number of measures in a model. It's not unusual to come across a model that has 200 or 300 measures that have all been written by hand. And when you look a little closer at these measures, there's often a repeating pattern in these measures. And so there might be in your core fact table a number of numeric columns, like what is the quantity of items that we sold, or what's the dollar value of items sold, and usually a handful of others around cost, etc. But then there's a pattern that says that perhaps applies a period comparison approach. So what was the value of the metric for the same period last week, or same period last month, or same period last year? There might also be another time intelligence like pattern that does a cumulative total, like a year to date, or month to date, or quarter to date. Plus also you've got other differences, percentage difference from a different period or a parent. So when you boil it down, what you find is quite often in these models that have 200 or 300 measures, there's only sort of 6 or 7 templates or patterns there. So calculation groups allow you to define a template or a pattern where you write the code, but you just put in a little placeholder for your metric. And when you start using calculation groups in your visuals, you can just drag any measure from your fact table. Ideally, it needs to be a numeric one, and it can start taking advantage of the template in the calculation group. But we're going to show that in a demo. So first and foremost, it's just simply designed to reduce what we call measure proliferation. I have to say that slowly, otherwise I get my tongue really tied up. So imagine you have 3 columns in your fact table and you have 3 calculation items. That means you've only got 6 DAX expressions to manage and maintain, whereas previously you would have had 3 times 3 or 9 DAX measures. Now that doesn't seem like much. That's only saving you 3 DAX expressions to have to manage. But then when you suddenly start saying, well, if I've got 10 patterns, 10 DAX patterns, and I've got 10 columns that I want to use these patterns over, rather than have 100 measures or DAX expressions to have to maintain, and there's going to be opportunities for errors to creep in there. I only have to manage this in 20 places, and that's when it really starts to make a difference. When you create a calculation group in your model, one of the nice things about it is it appears like a table. So when I go to a brand new model and say I want to add a calculation group to this model, a new table appears, and this table will have just 2 columns in it. One of the columns, and the number of rows in the calculation group will be the number of templates that you've got there. But one of the neat things about this is you can now drag that column to a visual, like a matrix, column header or row header. And this opens the doors for some quite neat scenarios as well, which I'll show you in my demo. Whereas normally when you're using a measure that uses the switch function to do something similar, you still can't drag the measure to an axis of a visual. So this does open some doors to do some quite interesting and creative things. So yes, the measure, it can be used on the axis, row and column headers of visuals. Right, so where can I use calculation groups? Well, interestingly, yes, you can use them in Power BI Desktop, but as I mentioned earlier, there's no user experience or UI feature in Power BI Desktop yet. Now, part of the reason is because, well, we need to bake this into the engine first and then build the UI. Well, you know, we should probably be doing this somewhat in parallel, but we can't do it the other way around. So, it will come. But certainly in any model that you author or maintain in Power BI Desktop, you can add a calculation group too. You just have to use third-party tools, and that's what I'm going to be showing today. You can add them to Azure Analysis Services, Power BI Premium. So once you have a model published to Power BI Premium, you can use the XMLA read-write endpoints to add calculation groups to a hosted model on the fly. But also you can add them to SQL Server Analysis Services 2019 is the important part. And I think there was a CTP that got released that enabled calculation groups. It's been out for a while. So if you're using the on-premise version of, or in a VM, SQL Server Analysis Services, so long as you're on the latest version, you can add calculation groups. So what I show you today in the demo will work for any one of these analysis services hosted in any one of these environments. So how do I create a calculation group? First and foremost, your model needs to be in compatibility mode 1500 or higher. Now, if you don't know what a compatibility mode is, just make sure that you're on the latest version of Power BI Desktop, or any version that's probably at least a year old. So hopefully you are on the latest version. But if you're using analysis services, either Azure Analysis Services or SQL Server Analysis Services, then this is just something you might want to check, because if you maintain a model that's been around longer, that you're slowly evolving and upgrading, it might still be set in an earlier compatibility mode. And I can show you where that you can set that in Tabular Editor. But the three main areas where you can create calculation groups at the moment are using Tabular Editor, which is the third-party community tool. It's open source. And using Tabular Editor, you can create calculation groups in a Power BI Desktop model, one that's hosted up in Power BI Premium and also in Azure Analysis Services. If you have the latest version of SSDT, SQL Server Development Tools, so this would be running in the any version of Visual Studio, including Community. That cannot connect to Power BI Desktop at the moment, but that can connect to a model hosted in Power BI Premium and Azure Analysis Services and add, update, and maintain calculation groups. So if you're already using SSDT, you know what I'm talking about, and it's baked into the UI of the latest version of SSDT. Lastly, for people who like to roll up their sleeves and get really hacky and work with TIMSL, Tabular Modeling Scripting Language, which is JSON-like, and TOM, the Tabular Object Model. So there are some client libraries that you can download and install in tools such as Visual Studio Code or including Visual Studio, and you can start connecting and scripting and doing some really low-level stuff that you would probably be doing if you're automating and maybe part of a BI team doing a lot of repetitive tasks that you just want to automate. And if you've heard of TIMSL and TOM, the good news is you can use either of these to create calculation groups in Power BI Desktop Premium and Analysis Services. If you're not using TIMSL and TOM, then I would highly recommend that if you're not already, that you would just focus on Tabular Editor. So I'll just pause there for questions before I jump to the demo. So,
do we have any questions? I don't think we have anything so far as as calculation groups that I've seen, Phil, in the chat window.
No, that's cool. Excellent. All right, well, let's jump over to my demo then. So I have a Power BI model. It's just a blank AdventureWorks model. It's a nice clean model with a sales table here, flicking off to a bunch of dimension tables. So this is our starting point, and I'll be sharing with you the after version of this. So we're going to create everything from scratch here to add a couple of calculation groups and just work through these. And in my canvas, I have just a couple of blank pages. So cool. So the first thing I want to do is let's focus on the sales table, and let's have a look at the sales table. There are a couple of columns here that I want to focus on, and if I zoom in, I'm going to be focusing on the order quantity column, the sales amount column, and the total product cost column. I'm going to create a calculation group that focuses on these. And in fact, before we start, what I'll do is I will create a visual that just has these metrics. So 1 row per day, order, sales, and total cost. And let's make this a little larger for my eyes. This is just as much for me as anything else. And if you haven't seen the ability to set the theme fonts, then hopefully you find this useful. We're going to customize the current theme. We're going to set the font size to be 15. Wonderful. Okay, so the next thing I want to do to this measure, this model, is add 3 simple measures, which I can do in Tabular Editor. In fact, what I'm going to do is add the first measure using Tabular Editor and the second 2 back in Power BI Desktop. So you can see how easy it is to work with these external tools now that we have this external tools option in the ribbon. So I'm going to click on Tabular Editor here, which is going to open it on my machine. And Tabular Editor here is connected to my model. And I'm going to expand the tables area, go to the sales table. And in my sales table, I'm going to create a new measure. My new measure is going to be called the sum of sales amount. And the expression that measure is going to compute is going to be sales amount. And when I go save, what we can see over here is the measure has been added to Power BI Desktop. That just appeared, which is pretty cool. For speed, I'll add the other 2 measures I want back in Power BI. So we're going to have a measure called sum of order quantity. And lastly, I'm going to have a measure called sum of total cost. Right. Excellent. Okay, so now, and we can see those here in Tabular Editor. So now we're going to create a calculation group. So back in Tabular Editor, in the model menu, I'm going to say I want to create a brand new calculation group. And it's going to create the calculation group in the section that groups tables together, because it is at the end of the day going to be a table in our model. I'm going to call this table or calculation group time intelligence. But when I expand the calculation group, it has different properties underneath the node compared to what a table has. I'm going to change the name. This is the column. There are 2 columns in this table. There's one that gives you the text description of the calculation item, and the other controls ordering. We'll come back to this to show how you can set the ordinal value to control the order that the calculation item appears in. But I'm just going to rename this to from name to time calculation.
Phil, do you mind maximizing the window?
Not at all. Not at all. It doesn't. I was trying to get this to
Yes.
zoom in and out.
It's okay. It's all right.
I
Just,
can sort of do this, but all
that's
right.
okay.
Now in Tabular Editor, I'm going to say I want a new calculation item, and we're going to add 3. No, I'm going to add 1, sorry. I'm going to call this new calculation item YTD for year to date. And in the expression, I'm going to paste in my DAX expression. And this is the pattern you would normally use for a year to date expression in this model. The only difference is, and I'll try zoom here. Excellent. This one does zoom. At line 2, normally in this position, I would place the column that I was creating this measure over. So this could be in the sales table over the sales amount column or the total product cost. But the selected measure function is a special function just for calculation groups. This is our placeholder. And this is the area that when we use this in our visual, that the actual measure that we use will pop up. So let's do that now. This is all we had to do. So I created the calculation group. I renamed the calculation group. I renamed the column, and I've added 1 calculation item expression, which I named YTD, and it has this here. That's all I've done. We'll go save. This commits my change back to Power BI Desktop. And if we switch back to Power BI Desktop, it's telling me that 1 or more calculation groups need to be manually refreshed. Let's do that. And we can see at the bottom of the list here, there's a table now called Time Intelligence. And if I have a look at the table in the data view, there we go. It has 1 row. Because I only have 1 calculation item, the item is called YTD, and there's an ordering column which is hidden here at the moment. Okay. So I'm going to drag the date column to a new visual on my canvas, and I'm going to drag my time calculation onto here as well. And in fact, what we'll do is we'll turn this into a matrix. So on rows we have date, and on the columns we have my time calculation. And I'm just going to drag the sum of order quantity and put that on. Cool. And actually, just for my own benefit, I'm going to turn off totals. Let's turn off row subtotals and column subtotals. Take that away. Okay, so my year-to-date calculation is saying 9, 42, 51, 57. It's just accumulating the values that are in the order quantity column. So now I can drag my sales amount column across. And we can see that this is accumulating 28, 71, 100. And that's 28 plus 42 plus 29. Or if I really want, I can also drag in my other measure here now. So these base measures, I haven't had to touch or change. They have no knowledge of the calculation group. But when I drop them into the visual that has the calculation group as part of it, the calculation group does the magic by taking the measure and substituting into that placeholder where I was using the function called select measure. So that's nice and easy. So that means I could now create new measures that I, in a week's time or a month's time, that I haven't thought of yet, and I can still use them with this calculation group. So let's extend the calculation group logic by adding another calculation item. I'm only going to add 1, but if you get the idea, once you've added a second one, you can sort of see how you can go and add a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, etc. So if we jump back to Tabular Editor, where we only have 1 calculation item, I'm going to right click and say I want to add a new calculation item. And this one is going to be a little more sophisticated. We're going to call this PD diff, which is short for previous day diff. I'm not necessarily recommending or advocating for using heavily abbreviated measure names. I'm just being lazy, which is sometimes it's perfectly fine. And now I'm going to paste in an expression. Whoops, and zoom in and let's have a look at this. We'll get rid of my notes. So this particular measure does something a little more sophisticated. It creates a variable which I call my today, which uses the placeholder. This is that same selected measure function we used in the previous calculation item. And I create another variable that just goes and grabs the previous day. So it's probably not one you're going to use a lot in your models, but it's easy to see visually here in my demo. And it's just going to return the difference between today's value and yesterday's value. That's all I've done. And I'm going to save this and jump back to Power BI Desktop. And I'm going to refresh my model. Cool. So what we can see here now is automatically I had my YTD calculation item measure here. That's what we saw before. But we now also have a PD diff. And what this is doing is it's saying, well, over here, 33 minus 9 is 24. And then going back to 9 is subtracting 24. And then I think 9 to 6 is minus 3. But if we drag in the sales amount, this is nice and easy to see on the order quantity. But if we drag in the sales amount, maybe I'll take out the order quantity. It's a little harder to see on the larger numbers, but believe it or not, this is doing the same. And I haven't had to write a lot of code here. And this will exponentially explode depending on the number of core measures that you want to be able to use and the number of calculation items you have. And I've seen some calculation items with calculation groups with over 100 calculation items, particularly with time intelligence, where you come up with all sorts of interesting period comparisons, and it works well. So that's the first demo. That's my first calculation item. I hope it looked easy to you. So long as you have Tabular Editor, and perhaps you watch this video, you should find it fairly easy to add a calculation item to your group. So the next demo I want to show you is quite a common technique that we see in DAX is dynamic measure selection. So the first thing I'm going to show to you today is how people typically do it using DAX, and then I'm going to show you the calculation item equivalent of that. And what I mean by dynamic selection is providing you the ability with a slicer to be able to click on a selection of measure to control what is displayed in the visual. But I'll show you. So to set up the DAX version of this, what I'm going to do is add a new table to the model. And this is going to be a disconnected table. It's not going to have a relationship to any other tables in the model. So this is going to have a single column, and these are going to be the values in the table. So if we go OK, so the table is called dynamic measures. And if we have a look at the contents of that table, it just has a single column with 3 values in it. And in terms of the data model, it's not going to be connected at all to the rest of the model. So the next thing we want to do, well, the next thing we normally see is a dynamic measure that does some cleverness to work out, based on your selection of that column, it'll control what is displayed. So we're going to create a measure. And the measure is going to be called dynamic measure, and it just performs a switch. Whatever you select in terms of a slicer from the table we just created, if you select order quantity, go and display this measure. If you select sales amount, go and select the measure that focuses on the sales amount. So now we have these two items added to our model. We can start creating an experience for the end user that looks like this. So let's drag the value up to the canvas. And my PC is just catching up. And we'll turn that into a slicer. And I quite like in slicers to use the horizontal slicer. They look much more like buttons. And I want my end user to have the ability to just click on one of these buttons to determine what's shown in the visual. So now I can drag maybe date and the dynamic measure, which was the switch statement, to my visual. And if I click on order quantity, we can see here that it's displaying that order quantity. Or I can click on sales amount and it's giving me the sales amount or total cost. And I can change this visual to be a line chart. And this This is quite a common technique that we see people using DAX and switch statements for. But unfortunately, there are some optimization challenges with this, and quite often this can be the reason behind some poor performing reports. So what I'm now going to show you is how you can use calculation groups to provide a similar experience, which is quite a neat thing. And this could be time periods as well, like, you know, showing a daily values or weekly values or monthly values. So I'm going to go to a new page, and we need to add a calculation group. So we'll jump back to Tabular Editor, and up on the model menu, I'm going to click New Calculation Group. And this calculation group, I'm going to call Calc Group Dynamic. And now we have two calculation groups. Something I'm going to call out is on the calculation group itself, there's a property here called calculation group precedence, which has a value of 1. Now my previous calculation group is set with a precedence of 0. So a calculation group can't share the same value for this property. And this property will determine in what order the calculation group will be executed. Now, in this example, my calculation groups aren't being used in the same visual, but you can nest them. You can apply more than one calculation groups for some quite clever scenarios. But it's important that you set the precedence so that you know that it perhaps does the average before the count or the count before the average, depending on what it is you're after. So with my calculation group, and I'll leave the name alone, I'm going to add 3 items. My first item is going to be called order quantity. And what I want my order quantity to do is execute sum of order quantity when it runs. I'm going to add another calculation item. This is going to be called total product cost. And that's going to execute the total product cost. And then finally, we're going to add sales amount. And the expression of this one should be it's going to call the measure that we created earlier in the session called sales amount. Finally, I need to add a measure, and a measure that's not going to return anything that we will see. It's just going to be a dummy or a placeholder measure. So I'm going to add a measure called dummy measure. You can call it what you like, probably something meaningful, and it's going to return blank. We're never going to see the output of this, and that's it. Whoops, did I hit save? I will do that now. Wonderful. So back over here, we now have a new calculation group called Calc Group Dynamic. That's what I named it. And what I'm going to do is drag the name column to the canvas and turn that into a slicer and set the format so that slicer looks like a nice button. We're going to drag the date column to the canvas and turn that into a matrix visual. And we're going to drag the name column to the row header of the matrix. Cool. And then finally, the dummy measure to values. Straight away, oh, and I'll turn off my totals, because row totals and column totals, well, certainly columns subtotals are probably fairly meaningless in this example. Okay. So now what I can do, and straight away you get, previously in the DAX example, this was blank until we made a selection up here. But what we can do with the calculation group is say, well, let's click on order quantity, and we see the order quantity. If we click on sales amount, we can see the sales amount. We can click on total product cost, and we can see the total product cost. And we can click on multiple of these and we can get them. And this will equally work with line charts as well. There'll be multiple series for these. So that's the example showing total cost is probably maybe quite small. What's the line chart? We need to probably put this in series. If we click over here, name in legend. should hopefully have 2 lines. We do have a very low line and a very tall line. So that's another example, a slightly more advanced version of what you can do with calculation groups. I do have an additional one that shows a more advanced scenario, which I won't build up from scratch, that showcases calculation groups. How are we going for time?
We're doing great. We have all the way until 8:30, so don't worry about this. But have a couple of questions that came up, Phil, if you don't mind.
No, go for it.
So if you flip this back to matrix, the way it was before. So would you say that another advantage of actually doing this way is because actually you can see the column header actually displays the selected measure.
Oh, compared to the
whereas
DAX solution?
Yeah, compared to DAX solution, it was generic because there was a question from Fernando. Could you please elaborate? Actually, not Fernando. How would you change the caption of the header after select of one of the slicers? And with the dynamic, I don't think that we can do it, right?
No. And also things like formatting become a challenge as well, which are solvable, but you're starting to get into a little bit more
Sure.
DAX. Because, my sales amount is a currency amount, whereas my order
Sure.
quantity is a unit amount, but they're both showing the same,
Sure.
2 decimal places, and other measures might be percentages as well, which you can use the format function to solve, but that
Return
has
text.
challenges like converts it to text, yes. So you need to go and set alignment, and makes other things a little harder, like totaling, etc. Whereas with the calculation group, one of the properties that you can set on the item is per item the
Sure.
format string. So we can go currency, I think, if I
Format them
spelled it correctly,
independently.
or however you like your formatting to look. I probably have a more sort of richer one here. So if we
I
go
think you
on
can
to,
drop down the drop down on the right side. Wasn't there a drop down where you can actually?
yeah,
There is nothing. Okay, cool. We got it. So there is an independent formatting, which is pretty cool. The second question that I have, and actually there's some other questions that are streaming in.
excellent.
So if you go back to your first demo that you did, page 1, I believe it was, where you had the 3 measures.
I think there are 2. There's a YTD and PD diff.
Right. So the way this is done is that you drag and drop the calculation group. So if we look at the data binding of this visual, we'll see that essentially there is just a time calculation. Very nice. Based on your experience, do your customers ask for more flexibility? For example, if I want to add a sales amount in between PD diff and year to date, obviously this is not possible right now because we have essentially the time calculation on columns. In other words, do you find yourself in a situation where the customers say, oh, great, this calculation group feature is great for actually centralizing the calculations in one place, but we still want to flatten this calculation items into separate DAX measures so that we can add them in any way we want to the report?
Yeah, well,
Does that
once you
make
start,
sense?
yeah, I think so. So let's try that as an experiment. Let's try and get sales amount in the middle of these 2. I haven't tried that before, but I suspect all we would need to do is go back to the calculation group and say, let's create a calculation item called sales item, and a sales amount maybe. And we can specify that this is the sum of sales amount. So that's what it's going to display. And if we want it to be in the center, we can set the ordinal. So let's make YTD maybe 3. Let's make sales amount 2. Hang on. What did I do? PD diff is 0, sales amount is 1, and YTD is 2. Okay, let's save that and see what that does. Because I mean, you can get quite creative with the measures here. Now, if we jump back to here, what we should hopefully see is PD diff sales amount and YTD, and the sales amount is matching the calculation group. So there is some degree of flexibility that is available to you in calculation groups, but you are having to make it as an item, and the item hard codes a measure, and you can turn it off by saying, well, actually, in the for this visual,
right,
you can decide whether you want to display sales amount
sure,
in a visual that whether you want it or not, kind of thing, and so you can you've got this control as well. So
gotcha. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I just don't imagine that if you have many measures, you want them actually all of them to be calculated items in the calculation group. So I guess based on experience, you don't see that being asked by customers to kind of still flatten them.
No, it's not a common thing I've seen. Either people have worked it out themselves and they don't sort of reach out for help saying, how can I do this? Or it's not a common ask. It's one of those two things.
Got you. So there is another question. So there's a question from Fernando. Could you please elaborate on the improvement in performance with the calculation groups approach?
Okay, so good that you picked up on that. So the switch statement is very flexible in DAX and can be quite useful, but what we do find is because of the complexity of trying to figure out on the fly what should be executed and what shouldn't be executed, and I'll explain what I mean by clicking on the switch statement. So ideally, in a perfect world, if I select the total cost option in my slicer, I would want this measure to only execute the code that belongs to this measure and not do any work in behind these two here. But what we do find in some scenarios, and particularly in larger switch statements, is the switch function does do more work than ideally you would want it to do. And to optimize that is quite a big effort. We're talking probably 6 to 9 months of quite heavy engine work to clean that up. In this case, I mean, it does do a very, very good job, but the calculation group is quite a new feature, and it's a lot cleaner, and it's a lot easier to optimize, making sure that when you do make a selection from your slicer or filter, that only the code that belongs to the code path of that node gets executed, and not any other work takes place. So this is starting to get to be quite an advanced topic, and for most people that are using this, if you don't see the performance problems, then don't worry so much about it. I'd recommend maybe trialing and playing with calculation groups just to learn, how it works as an alternative. But however, if you do have a Power BI report that has a visual that's taking a while to load, your slowest visual, and it does use the switch pattern inside DAX, then yeah, that could be a good candidate to trial calculation groups. You should be able to provide the same functionality, and what you might find is that it can do it a little more efficiently. So.
Great. And there is one more question from Rebecca. Can you use calculation groups to change what field is on the x-axis, I guess, of a chart? So in other words, can you use calculation groups to change not the measures, but the other buckets? Like, for example, you have date. Now you have date and name on the axis. Can we flip this? Can we use calculation groups to do it dynamically somehow? I guess is the question.
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. So here,
like,
for example, we have a line chart, and I've got the calculation group on the x-axis, but I can take it over to the legend, in which case it's now on the y-axis, I guess.
So she's asking, for instance, instead of date on the x-axis,
right?
So we can go away, day on the day axis, to put product. So for example, let's say you have a chart you start with, and you want to change dynamically what's on the axis bucket itself. kind of
Right.
just like what you have here on the slicer, but in the slicer we select a measure. Imagine that the slicer shows product and date as a two selections. So when I click date, I would like that field to go on the x-axis. And when I switch product, then I want that field to go to that bucket dynamically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like it should be doable, but I would like to probably get an equivalent hands-on example with some dummy data to understand for sure. But it sounds like you should be able to engineer the DAX expression inside the calculation group to maybe do what you want. But I'm probably a little slow on the uptake, I'm afraid, at spotting exactly what you need there.
Yeah, and I think actually the answer probably will be no, because I don't think we can put measure, dynamic measure in the axis. It has to be a field.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of the calculation group, is that you can put it onto the axis and it will allow you to perform a calculation. So
Sure.
there might be the opportunity. You just might have to come up with some clever DAX inside the calculation item, which I don't have prepared for you today, I'm afraid.
Gotcha.
Yeah, this is Stephanie. I think that you could do a selected value measure in your tabular, whatever it's called. Then in your external tools, you could do a selected value measure on, say, a product table. And so you could take, say, selected value of the column called measure, and then you could have your measures connected to that. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, the calculation items are just placeholders. They just give you the opportunity for you
this
to
is
be able
basically
to
just
make a
DAX
selection on that. And then if you happen to select it, it'll execute whatever code you put in here. Now, a lot of times you'll be using this placeholder functionality, which will overtake the measure that you've dragged in and take that value and calculate it based on the the additional rules in here. Or you can just overwrite and just put out your own hard-coded value or call a measure and do whatever you need to do with that. And sure enough, sprinkle it with some more if statements to understand what else has been selected. Like I say, you could have calculation groups on top of calculation groups to create a really, really an interesting experience.
Yeah, but I think that's over complicating the
Probably.
question that was being asked. Like if you go back to the PD diff or the year-to-date, either one, basically whatever you can put behind that comma on a calculate function, you should be able to make a calculation group out of.
Yeah.
Right? Because after
Yes.
after selected measure comma, just whatever is behind that, that's your calculation group.
Yeah.
So in this case, it's previous day. So it could be, your filter context for something on the product slicer.
Absolutely.
Cool. That's it for now.
Okay, so the last example, which I'm not going to build from scratch, is a showing how you can use calculation groups to do things like even just handle the formatting to determine what currency symbol to select. And I think over here we can see that the calculation item is determining, depending on the currency items here. These are calculation items, and these have rules built into them to say the same underlying value, which, believe it or not, all these numbers start their life as a US dollar amount. So it not only converts the value in terms of a currency conversion, actually gives it the right symbol as well. So if we have a look at this in Tabular Editor, and I'll make this file available as well, so you can, for those interested in looking at a more complicated example, you can see how this works. So we have a currency conversion calculation group. And all this does is either provide the value coming through, so the item in US dollars, or what it will do is it'll, if you're selecting one of the other values in the table, it will, here, format string, down here in the format string will use the appropriate display symbol. And I think that's over in somewhere else. Where is that? It's in the currency table. I might just check the model here. So the currency table is that. No, it's not that. Currency conversion. There's one other table in here. Off the top of my head, okay, I can't remember that off the top of my head, but this model has a couple of calculation groups that are used in combination with each other to control that more sophisticated use case. So like I said, I'll save this into the user group at the end. So I recommend having a bit of a play with that if you're interested in learning more.
So basically, you can use this technique to do currency exchange rate, to kind of convert currency dynamic.
Exchange rate,
right?
Including the display as well. Yes.
Got you. Could you go back to that converted currency? I just want to take a look at the formula, if you don't mind.
Yep, sure, no problem.
I'm sorry, in the Tabular Editor.
Oh, in Tabular Editor, absolutely. So
converted currency right there. Okay, so we multiply, we're dividing the selected measure by the currency rate, end of day rate. Okay, so basically this is the AdventureWorks end of day rate, right?
And importantly, it grabs the format string from the currency table for what's selected. So if we have a look at the currency table over in the model, the format string, let's just go where it's not blank.
Right. Formats them on the fly. Great.
Yeah, because most of the currencies in this table don't have one. But if you happen to select Japanese yen or the euro, it'll grab the value from here and use it to dynamically on the fly apply that format string. So this is showcasing like previously where you saw me hard code the format string. You can get smarter and actually have dynamic format string on top of an on-the-fly calculation that's taking what is the core US dollar amount, and depending on which currency you select, it'll apply this conversion on the fly, which is kind of neat.
Great. So. You will share the deck and the tabular, I mean the source file for this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
The
yep.
Power
So
BI desktop file. Okay.
I'll provide that after the session.
Awesome. That's great.
So we talked and we had a brief look at format string, and as I said, you can hard code format strings for calculation items, or you can apply a more dynamic approach. The ordinal allows us to determine the order the calculation items appear. So we were able to inject the sales item column to appear in the center. Now, by default, everything, all calculation items are organized alphabetically. But I have seen some quite neat blogs recently where calculation groups were used to create balance sheets or chart of accounts or accounting-like experiences where even the calculation item was injecting horizontal lines and using the ordinal to make sure that the items were appearing in the correct order, which was pretty cool. And lastly, precedence gets set on the calculation group itself. So if you have more than one calculation group, you need to make sure that that value is unique. If you're using Tabular Editor, it helps you, it'll stop you setting the same value to more than one calculation group. And I think higher or lower is where it gets calculated first or second, depending on that precedence property. So they're the main things that you can do to configure a calculation group. I'll come back to questions actually, but what I want to highlight is that everything I've talked about today, everything I've touched on today is covered in this URL shortened, so aka.ms calculation groups, but it also goes to a lot more detail as well. So again, I highly recommend you have a look at this particular document in the Microsoft online on documents. which just it goes to explain everything we've touched on today in more detail as well. But let's just jump back to, do we have any more questions there, Tio? How are we getting on?
I don't think we have any more questions, Phil. There is a great feedback. People are excited about this feature. They're planning to use it. You inspire a lot of interest. Thank you so much. How many of you, by the way, guys, on the, I guess on this meeting, how many of you actually knew about this feature, that this feature ever existed in Power BI? Okay, some people that knew. Yes, 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 I knew and have used it. Okay, so a guy in the cube, but there was some people that were not aware of it. And great. Awesome.
So do we have Guy in a Cube online?
No, I said that some people were saying that they heard about it from Guy in the cube.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, the guy has left the cube. He's not in the cube anymore. So.
They're always in the cube. They'll never leave the cube.
What are they doing in the cube? The two guys in the cube, or are there more guys now? It's okay. Cool. Great. Anything else you want to share, Phil? Or
No, just on the screen there are my contact details. Please feel free to reach out and fire me any questions you might have. I can't guarantee I'll be able to answer them super fast. That's either because of my time zone or I might be doing some things. But I do tend to play and work on these things as a hobby. When I'm trying to relax in my downtime. So it certainly helps me keep on top of things and helps me learn. So please feel free to reach out and fire any questions you have my way. But otherwise, thanks for inviting me, Tio.
Thanks, Phil.
It's been a pleasure being able to jump on and join your group. It's nice to see a whole bunch of enthusiastic people. So unless there are any last questions, I will leave you two there.
On behalf of the community, I want to thank you so much, Phil. That was fantastic. Guys, one more, I guess, opportunity to ask questions. If you've got anything, we're going to finish a little bit early today. It doesn't have to be about calculation groups, and there are some questions about anonymous sharing and things like this. If you want to use this remaining time, then I guess now it's the time. Check for raised hands. Paul Sutherland, you're raising your hand. Do you need help or do you have any question? Okay, so looks like there are some questions. Hold on a second. Can you use this with a published data set? You can create new tables. I guess I see what he means. So for example, there is a published data set, you get it from Power BI desktop, you connect to it. Can you actually use calculation groups? And Phil, I know what the answer is, but I'll let you.
Okay, sure. So if you have access to that model in Power BI desktop, then yes, you can add calculation groups exactly the same way we showed you today. Otherwise, if the model is already published, if you've published it to premium, then yes, you can use any tool that supports XMLA. So you could use Tabular Editor or SSDT or the scripting to connect to the model while it's hosted in Power BI Premium and add a calculation group on the fly to that model without having to bring it down to desktop and add it. But if you have published to shared, then you won't be able to connect because that doesn't have any ability to talk to it using the XMLA endpoints. And XMLA is the API layer that allows you to talk to from afar. So depends on where your model is published to will depend on whether you can add a calculation group to it on the fly. So yeah, if you're using premium, no problem.
Does that make sense, Bruce? Is that what you're asking? Or you're saying, I have a published data set, I want to connect Power BI desktop to it, and I want to let the end users create calculation groups, which is an advanced feature, probably they will never do.
Yeah, although the question I think was actually about create new tables. So again, it's the same thing where
right.
if you've got a model in Power BI desktop, then yes, you can create tables. That's what we do all the time. But once you've published it to Premium, then you can add tables, but you need to be using any tool that supports XMLA, the API layer level. So Tabular Editor would work, SSDT would work, other third-party tools would work too. But in shared, no, there's no XMLA. There's no ability to send those XMLA commands once it's in Power BI if it's sitting in a shared workspace. You would have to bring it down to desktop or find the version in desktop, add the tables, then republish to shared if you needed a table added.
Absolutely. There was another question which I can answer. Is a Tabular Editor part of Power BI Desktop? If it's not free or paid, where I can get it? Tabular Editor is a community tool that you can download for free. It's not part of Power BI Desktop, but that you can actually download it and install it. It's a great tool.
Yeah, and it's open source, and the main people that code in it and drive in it work very closely with our engineers. So sometimes when it's important for them to have a feature added, we will make sure we do that and work with them to make it a robust connection between the two. So it's not a completely 100% independent, unrelated product. We do work very closely and well with the main people who contribute to that product. So, but there's nothing to stop if you're a keen hobbyist for you to actually get involved and help improve Tabular Editor too. So you can just download the source code and make changes and commit and be part of the community. So.
And speaking about community tools, there is a question: how do you add DAX formatter edge in the external tool? I have a DAX Studio and Tabular Editor, but where do you get this DAX formatter edge? Is that SQL BI or?
No, we'll see. As you know, external tools is a relatively new thing, and the main tools like Tabular Editor, DAX Studio, ALM Toolkit. If you're installing the latest version, they will put into Power BI Desktop the hook it needs for the icon to appear into external tools. But if you go over to powerbi.tips, they've come up with a nice little tool that if you run it, I think they recognize about 30 external tools now. You can just go and click on what tools you want to appear there, and it will add it to your Power BI Desktop. If you haven't seen that, I think it's called business.do. I'll share my screen if you like, and let's have a look.
That'll be awesome.
Yep. So I'll jump back to my report. So that keen-eyed person has got DAX formatter edge. They've spotted that, and all it does is open the browser. It opens it in Edge.
Are you sharing your screen, Phil? Because we can see it. Sorry.
I thought I was. Cool. So under external tools, there's DAX Studio and Tabular Editor. I should probably have more here, but if we click on DAX formatter edge, what that does is open the Edge browser, and it opens it to DAX formatter, and that's it. And I can just copy my measures across to here. I still have to copy and paste here, hit format, and then I can paste it back. But if I go to Power BI.tips, run by Seth and Mike, they have got a utility now that you can download called
one tool to install them all.
Install them all. Business Ops, that's the one. And we click on Business Ops, and I might have this already installed. Business Ops. I'm just opening this on another screen. Is it coming up?
Don't see it. We just see Power BI tips.
Yeah. Let's open it. No. Download it here. Business Ops Beta.
Got it. Nice.
And then the idea is, here we go. External tools. Let's say I want to install that tool and Power BI.tips themes. There must be some more here if I scroll down. I think DAX formatter is probably down here somewhere where you can say I want it to open in Chrome, Edge, or IE. So let's click on Chrome, install tools. And hopefully when I look back at Power BI Desktop, maybe I need to close and reopen it.
So it's got to read the configuration. Yep, that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. I didn't know. It looks like the community kind of, that extensibility feature inspired a lot of interest.
And you can create your own external tool pretty easily. I'm doing a series on my blog site, dex.tips, at the moment on using Visual Studio Code for a lot of interesting ways to talk to and manage and update models and query the models. And the next blog I hope to next week will be showing how you can create a small app in Visual Studio Code and hook it into here. So you might have you just want to click a button on your external tools and it will go and export all your data, or dynamically create a bunch of measures on the fly. So here we've got, just from clicking their tool, I've added some additional things to my toolbar. Cool. So you can go and explore that, and there might be some useful or interesting tools in here.
Tools.
So
that's pretty awesome. You guys like that? Yes, cool. That was a great tip, Phil. Appreciate it.
That's all right.
Cool.
Power BI.tips.
Power BI.tips.
Yeah.
Great. Let's go and wrap up this meeting. Phil, once again, that was great. Just to remind you again, if you can share the deck and the file, that would be awesome, so I can upload it on our website. Thank you so much for doing this in the last moment for us.
That's all right.
Kind of filling it for Patrick. Tell Patrick that we're still gonna get him sooner or later.
Well, he does live in Atlanta, so.
That's right. He's gonna be. But thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Right. I'll see you
all.
October
Bye-bye.
5th for the rest of you. Bye, Phil.
Bye.